Before we begin, I wanted to give a huge shout out to the folks at Amazon Music for partnering with us on this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast. But more on this later. Right then, let's get right into today's episode. Nothing unites us quite like a good story. Whether it be with a drink in hand, or during a commute, or hell, even on Instagram, stories are the focal point of almost every conversation we have, regardless of what we're talking about, even the love of our lives, Formula One. When any Formula One fan speaks to each other, or even better, introduces a new fan to the sport, one incredible story almost always finds its way onto the conversation table. The story of Brawn GP, the £1 Formula One team that won both the Drivers' and Constructors' World Championship in the only season it ever competed in and then vanished forever. A story so good needs to be documented and shared with the world in all its glory. Today on the Inside Line F1 podcast, we're meeting a man who's tried to do just that and more. On this episode, we have with us Daryl Goodrich, the director of Brawn GP, The Impossible F1 Story, the critically acclaimed documentary on Disney+, hosted by none other than Keanu Reeves. Through the next few minutes, you will hear some insane anecdotes about Brawn GP, about Jenson Button, about Rubens Barrichello, and of course, the man himself, Ross Brawn. We will uncover some untold stories about that fascinating season, while also bringing you closer to Keanu Reeves and his love for Formula One. Visually, we all know that Daryl is such an entertaining storyteller, and I'm pleased to report that he's just as good while talking. Trust me, this will be one fun episode. Let's listen in. Now let's be honest folks, we are all addicts of good stories. Whether it be the story of Senna versus Prost or the one of Hamilton versus Massa, we all just feel so proud when someone really takes a good story and presents it to the world and immortalizes it in the form of a good movie or a good book. Now, the Brawn GP story is one that we have loved and experienced so much for the last decade. I mean, in 2009, I remember the kind of outreach it had and how surprised the world was. But even then, ever since Formula One became famous, it was not touched upon as much as the modern day stories of Verstappen versus Hamilton. Finally, we have a documentary, a series of sorts that tells you the inside story of the Brawn GP story and what made it so special. And who more capable to talk about it than the director himself? Daryl Goodrich, ladies and gentlemen, is on the Inside Line F1 podcast. Daryl, I am so glad that you have made some time here to talk to us about the series. The first thing I really badly want to know is how tricky is it to tell a story that's already been captured live? Because back in the day, I mean, so many of us fans have seen it unfold right before our eyes. You've taken the heroic task of trying to immortalize it in a documentary of sorts. Is it even trickier to capture something that's already out there for the world to see?
I think, is it trickier? No, I think what we did, or what we set out to do, was to tell the story behind the story, really. So everybody knows that Jenson went on and won the world champion. But actually, what's really more fascinating, more interesting, is the story behind that. How did he actually get into that position? What was happening with Honda and Brawn at that particular time? And how did somebody with no finance, no engine, no infrastructure in place as such, manage to take on the big might of Ferrari and Red Bull and all the big boys, and ultimately come out on top? So I think in the docuseries that we were able to make, being able to really kind of go into depth and to find out exactly what did happen and hear it firsthand from all the people who were there. And they've obviously had time to live this journey now, as it was 2009. But during the course of making the film, it just reignited actually the journey that they went on over that kind of 9 to 12 month period, and we're able to sort of tell that story, and it really helped us kind of dive deep into the Brawn 2009 championship year, really.
But Daryl, why Brawn in the first place? You initially, of course, made this lovely movie in 2017, Ferrari Race to Immortality. That was more about the early days of Ferrari, back in the early 1950s. Straight up back to 2009. Why did you now choose this one? What really firstly got you introduced to the story?
Yeah, that was an interesting one. It wasn't my concept. So
Uh-huh.
the original concept came from the writer and showrunner, a gentleman called Simon Hammerson, who is very close and has a friendship with Keanu Reeves. And the two of
Hmm.
them are obviously racing fans, love all motorsports, and it was their original concept. So they came up with this idea. Simon was actually there in 2009, filming behind the scenes and doing things with Honda. So he had a first-hand account of it. So originally, Simon wrote the script, the four-part docuseries, discussed it with Keanu, and they decided they wanted to collaborate and make this film. And then it went through a sort of chain of events, and ultimately they got involved with the UK production company, and Disney then became involved and commissioned the series. And Simon and Keanu were kind enough to bring me on board. I think they saw the Ferrari movie and a few other bits and pieces, and we had a number of conversations, and it was very clear very early on we had the same vision. It was very much their concept and their baby, but I had a similar vision, a similar objective of how best to tell this story, and I was brought on board as the director. So Simon was the writer and showrunner, Keanu obviously the exec producer and the host, and myself as a series director.
Right, so I really want to touch up upon that vision because we unfortunately here in India haven't quite got to see it yet at the time of recording. So I'm really unaware about what you've kind of showcased and how. So what really was that vision? Because from the trailer, I love how many people you've spoken to. And that's the interesting part. And what sort of personalities they are. What was your initial vision when you got into it, Daryl?
I think right from the outset, and the way it was written was very much to explore the journey from as many people as possible, and not just the obvious ones. So it wasn't just the Ross Brawn, the Nick Fry, Jensen, and Rubens, the sort of the key people at the forefront of it, but actually it was to dive deep into this story, and it was the people behind the scenes, the guys at the factory, the guys, the petrol guys, the guys on the factory floor who were literally scraping things together financially, just trying to make a car work. And it was their stories where it affected everybody. That whole Honda pulling out of Formula One back in 2009, that financial crash. It wasn't just the guys in the front, the guys in the public domain. It was the people at the back, and their stories are the ones that really resonated with us. You know, they had mortgages to pay, they had families to keep, and their jobs were on the line. And so a combination of the high glamour side of Formula One and the people at the ground level who really are the kind of the bread and butter chaps who really have to put the work in to make it work. And it was key from very early on that actually we wanted to have a very, very wide and diverse contributor base to be able to tell this story from different perspectives.
Wait, so just who are we looking at? You've mentioned the big four, of course, Rubens, Jensen, Nick Fry, and of course Ross Brawn as well. Bernie Eccleston makes an appearance, which to me, frankly, that's the biggest nerdy moment for me because when Bernie is telling the story of Formula One, it just ultimately makes it bigger. But who else can we expect to hear from? And what sort of insights have you gotten from them in the show?
Well, we had Luca Montezemolo, so the head of Ferrari. He was very, very important in helping tell that story. Christian Horner, obviously Red Bull, and Red Bull, as they were the key rivals during that championship, they were up there running and pushing and trying to win and take the title from Brawn. We had Mark Webber, we had Philippe Massa, and then there was a whole host of contributors. Nick Fry was obviously Ross Brawn's partner in crime, as it were, and then the whole kind of team, right the way down to Gary Holland, who was the fuel man, and his story itself is actually fascinating because he quit when Honda pulled out. Everyone thought they were out of work and out of a job, and there was a global recession, and he had a family, and he had to sort of focus on where was he going to earn his money. So he took a job as a plumber, and so at the first race they had a fuel guy who'd never done it before. And it was a disaster, and they were lucky to win in Australia because the timings on the fuel were just horrendous. And then they managed to sort of persuade Gary to come back subsequently every race weekend just to be basically a fuel guy at race weekends. Then he'd go back to his day job as a plumber. So it's those kind of stories, those kind of human stories, which just add layers of interest and make it accessible to a wider audience. Yeah, and that was key. It was key, very much a vision from Simon and from Keanu. It wasn't just a film about the Brawn success. It had to appeal to a bigger audience. I mean, motorsport fans will know the story and will watch the story, but we were desperately keen to make it appeal to a wider, broader audience. And these characters help do that.
Daryl, what was your journey in the story itself? I can imagine that you must be aware of the outside, like the bigger story of Brawn winning. But what was that discovery like for you when you heard these inside stories? Was your learning just about as interesting as anyone else as well?
Oh, totally. And I think that's why, hopefully, when you see it, you'll agree. But I'm not a hardcore Formula One fan by any stretch of the imagination. You know, I couldn't tell you one tyre from another or what goes in with the engine or any of those details. But what does interest me is a good human underdog story, which is what this was. And when I first met with Simon and Keanu and the exec producers, Neil Duncanson at North One Television, it was very clear early on. I said, look, I won't be able to give you the facts and the figures. And I said, and to be perfectly honest, I said, I find that dull and quite boring at times. So I said, I think a combination of your expertise, Simon's expertise and his knowledge of the Formula One world, and mine from a storytelling perspective, I said, actually, if we can get that balance right, that both of us are finding this film and this story interesting, then we've got a really good chance of making it work to a broad audience. And in fairness to the producers, we would sit in the edit suite and we would put in something, an element together, a scene together in the edit. And he would look to me and he'd say, A, do you understand it? And B, are you interested? And if the answer was no to either of those, then it wouldn't make the cut. So if I was still engaged in it as a non-petrol head director, if I was kind of still engrossed in the story and wanted to learn more, then ultimately, it would stay in the cut, and it worked well there. I thought it was a good combination of hardcore expertise and not so much expertise from my side.
It's a fun, immediate litmus test in a way. I mean, as a storyteller, I can imagine there being a degree of bias as well, because since you're the one directing it, I can imagine it'll be tricky for you to take a step back and analyze it rationally, because there's also a sense of emotions attached to it, right? That I'm the one who's made this happen, so I need to look at it in a more, let's say, that it has to make it in. Was that also the case with you, or did you have to really take a step back consciously to say, okay, right, am I seriously interested in all the shots here?
No, that was, to be honest, that was quite easy from my side. It was because it was very much a collaborative thing. I mean, I can't stress that enough. It is very much the writer, the producer, Simon, Keanu, myself, and the executive producer, Neil Duncanson. It was a collaborative team effort, and there wasn't one person would sit there and say, this is where it's got to be, let's do this. It was very much, we would talk about things, we would discuss things, and we would justify whether or not it should be in there. But ultimately, from my perspective, if I wasn't interested in it, I would say so. And 9 out of 10 times, the guys would agree, and we came to that kind of compromise. It had to, all the way through, it had to be engaging. And I honestly feel it's difficult because you haven't seen it yet. So you're coming at this from you haven't had the opportunity to view the series yet. But I sat and watched all 4 episodes with my wife the other day, who hadn't seen anything. So for the 2 years I was on this project, she saw it for the first time, and the 4 hours flew by. And I haven't seen it for 3 months since we finished the edit, but actually, I think we hit it. I think we nailed it as far as the interest factor goes. It holds your attention.
If you can do that to a non-Formula One fan, for people like us, I think you're really going to be hailed as somewhat of a messiah in a way, once the whole world has seen it eventually. Because I've been already hunting all the piracy sites to see, okay, can I get a link? Can I get something? But I think the wait makes it even more special back here in India. I want to talk to you a bit more about the collaborative process, though, because from what you're saying, is it just me, or do I feel that Keanu is more of the nerd now in this whole thing? Like, was he actually the Formula One nerd in the entire group here?
No. Keanu is very much into motorsports, motorbikes, as everybody knows, but also motor racing, Formula One. And he was very passionate about it. I mean, it was Simon, the writer. It was his original baby, and when he first told the story to Keanu, he immediately saw the strength of the narrative. And being, let's say, a big fan of racing, it kind of engaged with him. But he was also very, very passionate and dedicated to telling this story. He did his research. He didn't just turn up at the day and ask the questions. He was very, very, very genuinely interested in this story, and he really wanted to push and dive deep during the interview stages. And he said he did his research. He knew the story. We'd all read the numerous books, and we'd done as much history telling as we could before we started filming. But Keanu was very passionate about it, and I think that comes across. And it comes across as genuine as well. I mean, there's been a few reviews where they questioned why would Keanu get involved in a project like this? But then once you watch the show, you can see actually he is genuinely interested in the subject matter and the contributors, and that comes across very, very clearly and very early on.
And at what moment did you realize that, wow, okay, with him on, I think now it's going to make an even bigger difference? Was there any such thing?
I mean, it's definitely it helps immensely to be able to attach, someone of the success of Keanu Reeves onto a project like this. Definitely, but it was the series was commissioned. So I hear I wasn't part of the original commissioning process, but Disney bought into the story because they loved the story, and then when they heard that Keanu was going to be attached to it, it was an added bonus. It was an added bonus. So.
And what was it like to work with him generally, and also all the others? Because suddenly with Keanu and then all the drivers, then all the team principals and all the other people, that's a lot of personalities that are in the mix to make one show. And I'm not even talking about the people behind the scenes. So what was it like throughout the whole journey to just make things happen eventually? Was it as smooth as you'd imagined it to be?
It was incredibly smooth. I mean, Keanu's a professional, 100% professional. So he understands the whole process and completely. And what he's great at is making the interviewees feel relaxed as well. I mean, there was a lot of sort of early on, there was questions, you're speaking to a mechanic or, somebody on the factory floor, and they've got a Hollywood A-list actor in front of them asking them questions. Are they all going to kind of freeze up? Are they going to be kind of starstruck? Will you be able to get anything out of them? But he's such a genuinely nice guy and knowledgeable guy, and generally interested in what they had to say, and that immediately puts them at ease, and they relax, and they want to kind of tell the story, and it helped. It really helped us be able to kind of get that honest, candid answers from all the contributors, because you kind of got a sense they were reliving something that had happened, and it was a big part of their lives, and they were given the opportunity to tell this on camera to Keanu, who was absolutely genuinely interested in what they had to say.
I mean, they're going to be telling those stories to their grandchildren anyway, right? So might as well also tell them to Keanu in a way.
Why not? Absolutely.
But on that, I want to talk about all the things that happened behind the scenes, the kind of stories that really got you that interested. We obviously spoke of Gary the Fuel Man, but when you were in it, right, were there any particular moments behind the scenes that made you go, wow, okay, this is so much fun? Anything as such?
Well, I think what really drew me to the story was obviously the racing is the racing, and it was the 6 out of 7 wins early on for Jensen, and then not winning another race until he managed to come in 5th in Brazil. So that journey itself is actually fun, interesting, dramatic story from a storytelling perspective. But the behind the scenes stuff, the whole kind of financial crash, everybody pulling out. Nobody wanting, or initially, nobody gave Brawn a hope in hell in actually even making it to Australia, let alone turning out 2 cars and then ultimately winning in Australia. So, episode 1, right the way up to Australia, just getting to Australia is a feature film in its own right, and yet the story continues with all of the behind the scenes politics, the breakaway of FOTA during that time, the potential of the whole split with the whole Formula One teams, the relationships with Bernie and Max Mosley, and the politics that was going on, the internal politics between the teams and the head principals, and on the surface, everybody seemed. Certainly in the early days before Australia, all the other teams were putting their arms around Brawn saying, we want you to be part of it. We don't want to lose you. Don't worry. We'll help you out. As soon as they won in Australia, everything changed. And I think it was Christian Horner said, a great way to make yourself unpopular is to start winning. And they said, no, that's exactly what happened with Brawn. Everybody was prepared to sort of, they're not going to do it. They're not going to be a threat to us this year. They've got no engine. They've got no money. They've got a car that they've kind of shunted together. But when they came 1-2 in Australia, I said the whole dynamic changed. And those stories, that's what's, it's massively intriguing as a storyteller, to be able to sort of weave all of these other subplots. And on top of that, you've got this amazing race for the championship. So all the ingredients were there. It was as a director, it was a fairly easy story to tell because you weren't having to make the drama up. It was almost a case of we've got too much drama here. Where do we? That in fact, that actually probably became one of the hardest points in the edit was to what do you leave out because there was so much. It was so rich, and each episode is a standalone story. So for 4 hours, you've got a lot of content and a lot of stories, and it holds together rather well.
Wait, so what did you leave out? Because there's so much in that season. I mean, you can't pick anything, right? Surely.
I think there was. I don't know what we actually, what we left. I don't think we missed. I personally don't miss anything that we did leave out. Let's put it that way. There were scenes that were potentially going to go in there, and then we decided that actually they're not strong enough to drive the story further. So I'm trying to think now what we did leave out. There was a few kind of business and financial elements of the story which didn't quite make it, but all the good, interesting bits were definitely in there.
Well, isn't there a line from the famous show, The In-Betweeners? If you don't remember it, it's probably not that important. Something along those lines. Yeah.
Well, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, there's that. But now, Daryl, I really want to talk to you about the people, like Bernie and Christian, right? Two of the biggest, most influential people in Formula One. I really want to know, firstly, was it tricky to get their time? Because normally not everyone's that open to tell a story that's not really about them, right? Was it tricky to get them in the first place?
I'm probably not the right person to answer that one because the producers and the production had all of the contacts at that level. So I wasn't really involved in any of the negotiations of getting either Bernie or Christian.
Or even Luca for the matter.
Oh, Luca, yeah, absolutely. I was basically told we've got them, and then we'd be there. Yeah, so I had the easy part on that one without a shadow of a doubt. What I can say is that all of them were fascinating, and as you said, you rightly say, you touch on Bernie. I mean, it's almost what Bernie doesn't say. It tells so much more than what he does say in many cases. His facial expressions, his gestures. He's just captivating. And Christian is a great storyteller. You can sit and listen to Christian tell the whole sort of story over and over again, and he comes out with some gems. And one of my favourite lines in the film was when he refers to Jenson Button's agent calling him after Honda had pulled out, and basically said, "Can Jenson get a drive with Red Bull? He's out of a drive." And Christian just turns to him and said, "Look, it's 10 past midnight. Cinderella's left the ball. It's too late." Oh. And it was, and I just loved that line. It was like, "Hey, it's 10 past midnight. Cinderella's left the ball. You've missed the boat. So there's no drive for Jenson here." But they were all very, very fascinating and a pleasure to listen to.
But what was the process like to speak to them in the first place? Because I can imagine as a team, you folks might have a few points you want to touch upon, but then trying to get those elements out of them. And Bernie especially is known to be a tough nut to crack, right? He'll only tell you what he wants to tell you. So what was it like, A, having a list of things that you wanted from him, and then B, trying to get it out? Because I can imagine that being one of the trickiest parts of the film, if not the most one.
Well, I think... I'll say revert back to Simon, the showrunner. It's a shame he was going to be on this call, but he's in LA, and the time difference was just so extreme. But Simon knew this story better than anybody, far better than I did, as he lived it back in 2009, and he'd written the 4-part series, and he knew pretty much every nuance of what had happened. And Simon was very clear, and he was with me every step of the way. And so at the interviews, I would make sure they would look nice, and we were getting what we needed from a visual perspective. And editorially, Simon was on it he was punching in when he needed to and probing. But at the same time, Keanu was fully aware of what he needed to get out of it. So as a combination of the three of us, we managed to elicit enough material. And there's in many instances, Bernie in particular, it's what he doesn't say that says a lot. As you say, he's a very, very bright, sharp individual. And the moments where he just pauses or he just looks at you and doesn't answer directly, but they're priceless.
Was it a similar experience with the main four, the Brawn GP, the proper quadrant? What was it like speaking to them? Was Rubens very open, 100%? Because in a way that wasn't his season, but still he's such an integral part of everything that happened in a way.
Yeah, all four of them were fascinating, and we spent a lot of time with all four of them. And it's fascinating hearing everybody's stories from a slightly different perspective. So Ross was obviously intrinsic. Well, all of them were intrinsic throughout the whole of this story. But we spent 2 full days with Ross right from the beginning and the whole journey all the way through, and the same with Nick Fry. We'd read everybody's books as well, so all of them had written books about this account. So we'd obviously all read the books and heard it, read it firsthand. But to hear them talk about the story, that was really quite fascinating. And Rubens, you mentioned Rubens, he was very candid and very open and very honest. And it was a painful season for Rubens. He didn't have a drive at the beginning. He was out of contract. He was then brought on a 4-race contract. So he didn't know at the end of each 4 races if he was going to have a drive again. He'd come from Ferrari to Honda to this independent team with no money, no finance, and trying to bolt a team together. And yet he, all the way through it, had this self-belief that he could do this. This could be his season. He knew the car was working well, and he had the capability and the self-belief. And yet it didn't go for him. And it was hard. Those first 6, 7 races, Jensen's winning, and Rubens is that kind of almost but not quite. And you felt his pain as he was talking through his season. And then when he gets his first win and then his second win, and the tide feels like it's changing and the pressure has changed on Jensen, it's building on him now. Suddenly he could feel the title slipping away, and Rubens was actually taking the upper hand. And you could just, when he was talking about the story, you could just feel the genuine passion and excitement that he felt he had a chance of winning this. And you're with him right the way to the end. And then ultimately, even though he got pole position in Rio, his home Grand Prix in front of his home crowd, he's going to win this. This is made up for him. And then it all went wrong. And you feel for him. There's that emotional journey you go on with Rubens. And he's such a genuine guy. He openly talked about the tears that he cried afterwards when he knew his dream had gone. But once he'd got that out of his system, he was there with Jensen. He was arms around him. He was partying with Jensen and the team, and he was one of the Brawn team that had pulled off this miracle. And it was such a genuine, again, just a very heartfelt, genuine interview that it comes across, and you can't help but feel for him. And all the 4 main characters were very open and very candid.
I'm so glad you've touched up upon this side story as well, in a way, because in Formula One, we just don't tend to talk about the so-called number 2 drivers as much, but the emotions that they feel while the team is winning. I think that is such a brilliant plot to capture. But on Jensen as well, it's interesting you mentioned this, because most people know of the fairy tale side about the wins he got initially, but there was a patch in the middle where he didn't win a lot. And then the championship came in eventually at the very end of it. How open was he in answering about that part, and also about his past as well? Because leading up to Brawn, it didn't seem like Jensen Button was ever a world championship contender. I mean, there was surely hopes and dreams, but he was never really looked at in that regard. Have you been able to capture that as well as a part of the series?
Yeah, very much so. And again, Jensen very open, very honest, and he had his self-belief, but he hadn't made one race prior to the start of the Brawn season. And so his track record wasn't brilliant. Ross was very open and was questioning whether or not he felt Jensen had what it took to become a world champion, as was Luca and many other contributors. There was always this question hanging over: is Jensen a world champion driver? And over the course of the story, and listening to Jensen himself, who even he even tells a beautiful story about when he was a child and his father was driving him around the circuits, and he had a particularly bad weekend, and he's in the back of the car. His father thought he was asleep, but he overheard his father talking to his stepmother and saying, "I don't think he's got what it takes." And he said, "I was awake. My father thought I was asleep, and I heard that." And he said, "And the pain and the hurt I felt as a young child in the back of a car, thinking, wow." And that all these years later, now all of a sudden, all these years later, he's become a world champion. And he said, and those moments resonated with him and they stuck with him. And he said, and that the point mid-season when he'd won, 6 out of 7 races, he was convinced he was going to win it. At that point, he said, what could go wrong? And he literally, they were his words. This is my championship year. And then the pressure, Silverstone came, and the intense pressure of racing in front of your home crowd, and it all started to go wrong. And the dynamic change, and that's what, again, it makes it fascinating from a storyteller's perspective. The whole change of the arc, the story arc, and the dynamic relationship between him and Rubens at that halfway point was a pendulum swing. And it definitely changed, and the pressure was getting on Rubens. The pressure was building internally within the team mechanics and within the team, and two sides of the garage between Rubens and Jensen. And even though they're teammates, you got a sense that actually suddenly they're not such teammates anymore. They're competing against each other. And that human story was fascinating, how the desire to beat your teammate is almost more important than being beaten by anybody else. A number of people said they would rather be beaten by any other team than by your own teammate. Because if you're beaten by your teammate, in theory, you've got the same car, the same vehicle, the same setups. Yeah, if you've been beaten by a teammate, you've done something wrong. Is he a better driver than you? Ultimately, he's a better driver than you on paper. And that was the mindset. And so with Rubens being beaten by Jensen for the first 7 races, and then it changing, that human story and that relationship between the two definitely comes across. And that's one of the main focuses of episode 3, of that relationship between Rubens and Jensen and the dynamics, how it changed.
And that's not about it as well, Daryl, because then you've got the story of Ross Brawn himself. And I love how much there is to showcase, which is why I'm now dying to see it so badly. But on the story of Ross as well, it's also one of confidence as well, in a way, because he just said, fine, I'll do it. Do a job that he's never ever done before, managing and owning a team. That stuff as well. Then the team management, then the driver management, then the politics behind it, then getting the engines, then Honda. What else can you get from Ross Brawn? I think that part is one thing that I'm most excited to see. Him actually showcase his emotion behind it. Was it as good as you expected it to be with Ross?
Yeah, he's a fascinating character. I mean, everyone refers to him as the bear, or he's like your the gentle giant. And then Christian, again, another Christian quote is priceless. He refers to him as like a silent assassin or a smiling assassin. He said, Ross Brawn would, sell his grandmother to get a victory. And he said he comes across as this nice, gentle giant, yet he's the most competitive man he has ever met. And he probably is. You don't become that successful without having that competitive edge. But I'd say Ross was, becoming a team principal, is a massive change from what he was used to at Ferrari and what he came ultimately to Honda as, and but to then take on the whole responsibility as he did along with Nick and the other guys. It was a fascinating 12-month journey for him as well.
Daryl, I love how deeply you immerse yourself in all these stories. It's kind of amazing how, as a non-Formula One fan, you're so deeply ingrained into it, which is why I just really want to talk about your style of filmmaking as well. We've seen some of your work before, obviously, but in the future projects, right, and in more things that you're planning to do, what are you trying to communicate with your stories? I mean, is there any particular visual style that you love to follow? Or is it generally, how can I get deeper to the emotional side of the story?
I think the emotions is the key to all of these stories, really. I think, I specialize in sport. I've been in sport my whole life as a director, as a filmmaker. And sport is is a great subject. If you're going to tell an emotional story, then tell a sports story, because you've got that, you've got all of the drama you could ever write in a scripted film. In an unscripted true story, it's all there in spades. And it's ultimately, for me, whatever the sport is, it has to be that emotional connection with the story that you're trying to tell. I must say, I'm not a motorsports fanatic by any stretch, but I have now made a number of motorsports films. But again, they've all been kind of led by the characters and character driven. And ultimately, that's what you always look for as a storyteller. It's the characters. I like to think I'm a visual director. I'm very much come from a graphic design background and a visual background, and I take a lot of time and pride in the vision and how something looks. But if the characters and the narrative and the emotions not coming across, then the most beautiful picture in the world doesn't mean anything. If that story's there and you manage to get into the heart of that story, and that is coming across with integrity and a genuine belief that this is true, then the pictures are secondary almost. But if you can combine the two, beautiful pictures, beautiful imagery, and an amazing story, then what more can you ask for?
But I love this because in the past, we used to have such limited scopes and opportunities to showcase stories like these ones. But nowadays, since we have some sort of OTT media platforms, it's amazing how we're able to capture all these niche stories and bring them to light. In a way, Drive to Survive as well. Yes, even though it might be a completely different form of storytelling, it's opened up the sport to so many more people. And now there exists a secondary sub-audience who know Formula One broadly, but now stories like yours, the one you're portraying through Brawn, can get them deeper into the sport. It's kind of fun, right? Are you looking at more opportunities at other sports as well after this one?
Oh, totally, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the whole unscripted sports feature documentaries, theatrical documentaries around the sports world has gone stratospheric. I mean, I guess Senna was probably one of the first groundbreaking ones, which put it onto a different level. I mean, without a shadow of a doubt, that elevated the narrative and the storytelling and the emotional integrity that you can get out of a sports story. And kind of since then, it has definitely been on a trajectory, and there's a real appetite for it. And Netflix and Amazon and all the streamers has definitely helped. Obviously, they've given a platform for these, but there is an appetite for it. Which is great from someone who specialises in sports and makes a lot of sports films. Yeah, it's a perfect time now to really kind of exploit it and to make more.
And Daryl, a couple of more things I want to talk to you about. Firstly, can I in some way entice you to make a story on cricket? There's a billion people waiting to watch it. It'll be really fun to see how you do it with your style as well.
You know what? Cricket has been something that has been bubbling away for a long time. And bizarrely enough, many years ago, I was very close to doing a scripted story around cricket. But it, for numerous reasons, it didn't come off. But yeah, cricket is something that is definitely bubbling around, and it's just finding that right story. And you just said there's a massive audience, especially in India. So it's, if it's the right story, I would definitely be interested and look at that.
No, we need to send you a few shortlists anyway. But that's cricket. We'll be sending across so many different ideas. But the little motorcycle racing nerd inside me so badly wants to speak to you about Sheen as well. I mean, the story of Barry Sheen, right? I just hate the fact that we have piracy and piracy laws and all that stuff protecting us from being able to watch it back here in India. Because ever since I saw the trailer last year, I was like, God damn, now I want to watch this. But
I haven't been able to see that. You haven't been able to see the show.
I haven't yet legally at least. So that's an issue in a way. But how did that come about? How did you discover the story of Barry Sheen? Because for all the folks who haven't, my only question is why not?
Yeah, that's great that you've asked me about Barry Sheen. That's awesome. So I grew up with Barry Sheen, so I knew him as a child. He was this kind of iconic hero in the UK.
Hang on, grew up as in like literally grew up?
No. Sorry, he was kind of. He was older than me, but he was the big star. As I was a child growing up, Barry Sheen
Oh,
was
that
this
way.
kind of,
Oh, I thought you sort of knew him personally as well.
no,
So that,
no, no, no,
right,
no, I
right.
didn't know at all. So, I was a child growing up. Barry Sheen was this kind of glamorous, good-looking, lots of women, money, success story that we were aware of, and it was always kind of there, and I was always aware of him. But that was it. But then, as I became older and became a filmmaker, and one thing and another, I'd made a number of films for BT Sport Films, which is a UK channel that specialised in sports documentaries. And I knew that I'd made a boxing film on Frank Warren for them, which was a biopic, a 90-minute film about a boxing promoter. And that had been received rather well. And I was in conversations with them afterwards, and they were looking for something to do with motorsport. And they were saying, we are looking for a film motorsport based. And of course, Barry Sheen's kind of always been there ticking away in the background. And his story had been done before, had been told so many times before, but to an older audience. I mean, his story was, he was from the 70s, and it was a different time. It was a completely different time. It's 40 years ago from where we are now. And yet there are so many parallels that where we are today, in conjunction with where we were in 1970s, with all of the social issues, the economic issues, the political issues, the unease within the communities. And yet you had this guy from East London who took everything by the scruff of the neck and became this superstar. He went stratospheric and became a world champion and was living the high life and was flying around in helicopters and had glorious, glamorous women on his shoulders and everything, driving around in Rolls Royces. And the nation took him under their arm and loved him for it. And it's kind of historical in the UK. We're terrible at building somebody up only to knock them down when they become too successful. And during the 70s, when Barry was at his highest, the UK and most of the UK were struggling in a terrible state with strikes and 3-day weeks and a whole load of power cuts and everything else. And yet the nation took Barry Sheen under their arm and really looked up to him as this kind of hero-like figure. And I found that fascinating, how how as a nation we looked up to him, and remembering it as a child. So when BT said they were looking for a sports film or a motorsport film, I thought Barry Sheen immediately popped to mind. But I couldn't do it. I didn't want to just do a Barry Sheen, this is where he was born and this is how he ended up story, which has been told to death. And there's been numerous news footage and documentaries. So I said we have to look at it slightly differently. So we structured the film around what was happening during a 10-year decade, during the decade of the 70s, where the country was collapsing all around for different reasons, and yet he was rising high to his highest peak. And we ran a parallel story of the state of the nation with the rise to into the heights of this motor racing guy. So it was enabled us to tell a slightly different story. So a story that had been told before numerous times, but come at it from a slightly different way. And it was a lovely little film to make. It wasn't a huge budget, but I really enjoyed making it. And as you say, he was such a charismatic character. And unfortunately, he died way too young. But yeah, sorry, I kind of probably digressed a bit. But I'm pleased you even were aware of it.
As a motorcycle racing fan, Barry Sheen is the Barry Sheen, right? And I mean, it kind of, I know I'm digressing a little bit. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the story of Paul Gascoigne as well, in a way, as someone who's so good on the pitch and known for his antics off it, but then how the people still kept on supporting him till the very end. And how, even though people know the tough times of Gaza, people still remember him for what he was in the past as well. So kind of fun how you're able to bring out these stories. But Daryl, one last question on Brawn and what's up for you next? What's up in the pipeline? Are you building something fun, interesting? Is there any motorsport story that's coming up?
There's I've got two fairly big projects. One I can't talk about, unfortunately, at the moment, and but it is a sports base, but it's not motorsports, and it's a series. But that's a little bit on a. It's a bit too sensitive at the moment to talk about that one. But the other one, which I am very much interested in, is I don't know if you're aware of Frank Warren, the boxing promoter. Is that a name that's
not as much? No.
So Frank Warren is a very high, prolific boxing promoter in the UK. and he looks after Tyson Fury. So he's Tyson Fury's promoter. He's at the highest level of boxing. And I made a film about Frank a couple of years ago, and it was a 90-minute documentary about his life. And he's got a very colourful life, how he changed the whole face of boxing from when it was run by a cartel and it was all kind of underground and everything else, and ultimately became this multi-million-pound business. And in parallel with Frank, we're developing a scripted drama about the life of a boxing promoter. No, this is scripted as opposed to unscripted. And that's a kind of a passion project that we've been working on for a while, and kind of pushing that one. That's taken a bit of momentum as well. So there's that, and as you say, there's I'm always on the lookout for good sports stories to tell.
Oh, it should be fun to see them all coming. But Daryl, thank you so much for your time. If in case I wasn't excited enough already, I know it's my excitement for Brawn has gone to a different level, and I can hope that it's the same story for most of our viewers who I hope in the countries that they're in are able to watch it immediately. But Daryl, thank you for your time. Thank you so much for coming out to the Inside Line F1 podcast.
You're very welcome. Nice to meet you.
Awesome. And folks, in case you enjoyed this episode, which I know you did since you're here till this point, please support the channel by subscribing to the Inside Line F1 podcast and sharing this episode with all your friends and family members who might be interested. Take care, folks. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast. Before we ended, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Amazon Music once again for partnering with us on this episode of the podcast.